Greetings and salutations, friends, to the Officio Assassinorum. Over the course of this mini-series, you will learn all there is to know, at your own risk, about the Imperium's hyper-secretive order of assassins, their weapons, their tactics, their organization and deployment, and why it now requires a 2/3 majority in the Senatorum Imperialis, or the High Lords of Terror, the supreme political bodies of the Imperium, to even just deploy a single assassin. For the assassin's blade, if utilized too liberally, can be just as great a danger to the Imperium as to its enemies. And thusly, to encourage a more complete understanding of this most invaluable, but also dangerous tool of the Imperium of Man, we will start with the Officio Assassinorum itself, all the way back to its very founding at a place called Mount Vengeance, where 6 individuals, all masters in their own forms of subterfuge and murder, came together to form the Assassinorum. And each one of the individuals present would take up the title of Director Primus of one of the assassin orders, each specialized in the art of liquidation most favored by its director. Each order would also be named after their director: Sire Vindicari, Sire Eversol, Sire Calexus, Sire Vanus, Ceres Venom, and Ceres Calidus. These 6 were also joined by a 7th individual who would not command a temple of his own, but instead be granted the title of Master of Assassins. It would be his duty to ensure the smooth operation of this newly founded organization, seeing to the needs both of the directors and their orders. This was expected to develop into a major logistical and organizational undertaking, for it was agreed by the directors that the future would require a more formulated approach. The galaxy was a big place, and the Imperium was growing ever larger, containing ever more people that on occasion needed accidenting. Examples had to be made, and obstacles needed removing. And there were but 6 assassins. That would never do. And so the original 6 would instead withdraw from their sport in favor of training others, and by so doing, massively increase the righteous reach of the Emperor's wrath. And speaking of the Emperor, where was he in all of this? That is one of the interesting parts, for whilst there could certainly be no true secrets from the Emperor, the assassins carried out their work in as much secrecy as their considerable skill set allowed them. For whilst they were certainly acting in the Emperor's interest, they were not acting in his name. It was a key tenet of the Assassinorum that the Emperor should not be involved in their business directly. Preferably, he should not even know about it, for they were more than aware that many within the Imperium would not approve of the actions of the Assassinorum. They would call it dishonorable and underhanded, possibly even traitorous, for it was self-evident that the Imperium of Man was perfect, and that humanity possessed a manifest destiny to rule the galaxy, and therefore, what possible need could it have of such dirty tricks? Because of such sentiments, it was desirable, indeed even necessary, to place as much distance between the Emperor and the Assassinorum. In case the Officio's business ever came to light, the Emperor would have plausible deniability, leaving his own pristine visage unsmeared by the darker, yet necessary actions of his Imperium. As for the extent of the Emperor's true knowledge of the Assassinorum, well, that is a little unclear. The Emperor absolutely knew about it, of that there is no doubt, as he would eventually turn it into an official organization of the Imperium, But how much he knew, and when he knew it, is a subject of considerable debate. The Emperor had a bit of a soft spot for those closest to him, as we saw very clearly with Lorgar Aurelian, who, despite being in clear and conscious opposition to the imperial truth, and despite being repeatedly censored for that opposition, was still given one last chance, with the example made out of Monarchia, a chance not offered to the two other purged legions. And, with the seventh man of the Assassinorum being none other than Malcador the Sigillite himself, it seems entirely plausible that even if the Emperor could have known everything there was to be known about the Assassinorum, he may simply have chosen to not dig too deeply into one of Malcador's pet projects. For not even the Emperor's own sons, the Primarchs, could claim to be quite as close to the Emperor as Malcador could. And it is thusly entirely possible that Malcador's stated goal of keeping the Emperor clean of the dirty business of assassination may simply have been the truth. He may quite simply have wished to protect his Emperor, his friend, possibly even, from these darker dealings. But during the Horus Heresy, after a failed assassination attempt, several failed attempts in fact, upon Horus Lupercal, Rogal Dorn learned of the existence of the Assassinorum, and he would eventually choose to make his knowledge of the Assassinorum clear, in a very Imperial Fists kind of way, by storming their inner sanctum with a dozen Imperial Fists, with himself at the head, in full battle plate, no less. Rogal Dorn had had a member of the Adeptus Custodes followed, as they too were aware of and peripherally involved in the business of the Assassinorum, particularly with the attempts to assassinate Horus Lupercal. Rogal even confronted the Custodes in an attempt to see if they would be transparent with him, if they would confess their dealings and knowledge of the Assassinorum without him needing to take it any further. But the Custodes declined to live up to Dorn's exacting standards, leaving Rogal with no other option but the Imperial Fist option, the least subtle option. The testy confrontation between 6 of the finest assassins in the galaxy, the Custodes and the Imperial Fists, only came to an end when the Emperor himself made an appearance within the so-called Shrouds, the hidden headquarters chambers of the Assassinorum at the time. The Emperor had clearly kept close tabs on the movements of his Custodes, his Imperial Fists, and his friend Malcador. And whilst clearly the Assassinorum remained a valuable tool, it required oversight. It required governance and control. It could no longer be allowed to operate purely in the shadows. And so he would take them from the shadows and into the light. The Assassinorum was no more, and instead, the Officio Assassinorum was born. Internally, this change would mean little to the assassins themselves. The directors, the temples, the clades, and the orders would continue to operate in much the same way that they had always done. They would maintain their own systems of recruitment, of training, and of equipment, but integration into the wider Imperium did come with some perks, like proper official access to astropathic choirs and the navigator houses. Previously, the Assassinorum had acquired access to these vital services either through improvisation and subterfuge, or via the Master of Assassins, Malcador, pulling some strings behind the scenes. But now that they were official, they could request secondments from these vital They could request proper secondments. The Assassinorum would eventually develop their very own stable of astropaths and navigators, allowing them to both communicate and travel across the length and breadth of the galaxy far more effectively and secretively than previously. And along with these perks also came increased general support from the rest of the Imperium. The Officio Assassinorum was considered to be a potentially very valuable weapon against the renegade Warmaster and his traitors, and assassin operatives were dispatched in hitherto unprecedented numbers against various leaders within the rebel forces. This would see a great deal of attrition imposed upon the various assassin temples, who would have to considerably increase the scope and scale of their training operations, as now they were not merely facing alien warlords or renegade humans. Now the assassins were also being dispatched against the Legiones Astartes, and they were by no stretch of the imagination soft targets. This in turn meant that the casualties amongst the assassin temples were skyrocketing, and right alongside the casualty rate, the demand for assassins was also skyrocketing. A classic case of supply and demand this. There was an overabundance of people needing killing, and not enough assassins to go around. The Horus Heresy was to become a very busy time for the 6 directors of the Assassin Temples, as they all had to massively expand their training and recruitment processes, as well as, of course, the production and acquisition of specialized equipment, that perhaps being the most difficult part of all. Every single Exeter's long rifle is a masterpiece of firearms engineering, and let's not even begin talking about the Colexos Assassin's specialized Animus Speculum, a piece of kit so specialized and advanced that even the people making it barely know what they're doing. And to further complicate matters, the 6 directors could no longer rely upon Malcador as much as they had in the past. It was his considerable intellect and organizational skills that had created the Assassinorum in the first place. But Malcador was plenty busy putting out fires all across the Imperium and organizing the Grey Knights, his new hyper-secretive pet project, which left the directors to mostly fend for themselves during the expansion process. And several of them did not have the temperament, shall we say, for that kind of office work. Nevertheless, with the aid of other Imperial organization, the expansion process of the 6 temples went ahead as smoothly as one could expect, considering the circumstances and the leadership. This also appears to be an opportune time to discuss the organizational structure and the inner workings of the Officio Assassinorum, now that it has been fully founded. Each of the directors remain in control of their own temple, the Vindicari Temple, the Calidus Temple, the Eversor Temple, and so on. Each one of these temples is located on Terra, and each temple is a massive hidden complex containing all of the various facilities required to recruit, train, support, equip, and repair the equipment of all assassins currently in active service. The exception to this being the Eversor Temple. They have a central temple which acts as the indoctrination and training center, but once an Eversor is fully finished, e.g. turned into a drug-fueled, maddened berserk monstrosity, it was reasoned that keeping them all in the same place might be a hint volatile. In the same way as storing barrels of nitroglycerin in a bouncing castle at a McDonald's might by some be considered a tad irresponsible. And so instead, the Eversor assassins are stored in various locations around Terra, inside cryo-suspension chambers, in which the assassin's body is quite literally frozen and preserved in perfect condition until he can be thawed out. The thawing process, too, is a lengthy and complicated one, where the Eversor assassin is de facto programmed for the duration of his mission. We'll get more into this in the ever so lore video, but for now, all you really need to know is that this programming includes who he is supposed to kill and, equally, if indeed not more importantly, who he is not supposed to kill. Hopefully, presumably, possibly, ensuring the safety of the people thawing him out. As for the other temples, their tasks were a little bit more straightforward. They simply required more training chambers, more armories, more simulation rooms, and, of course, most vitally of all, more recruits. This was a bit of a complicated process, as each temple was responsible for its own recruitment process, and as you can probably imagine, not everyone is ideally suited to being a stone-cold killer. Especially considering the nature of some of these killers, like the Careless, requiring very, very, very special individuals indeed. But, slow and torturous as the process inevitably was on occasion, it was advancing. The temples were growing steadily in size, and also in power and influence, which was not necessarily an intended consequence. The idea of making the Officio Assassinorum a proper, complete part of the Imperium was of course oversight, control, and responsibility, whilst in reality, due to the result of the Horus Heresy, the death, or de facto death, of the Emperor and Malcador, the people who were supposed to be reigning in the Assassin Orders were no longer around or able to do so. In the case of the Officio Assassinorum, the loss of Malcador the Sigillite was, of course, the hardest blow. He had fulfilled the role of Master of Assassins. He had been the one who kept the directors in line, who organized the Officio on a larger level, and made sure that they were all working towards a common goal: the betterment of the Imperium. And perhaps most importantly of all, the Master of Assassins was supposed to be the safety valve, the guy who hit the brakes should the various temples and their directors get a little bit overzealous. And so, whilst there was no replacing Malcador, it was decided that the position of Master of Assassins was too important to leave vacant. The 6 directors would vote amongst themselves on which one of their number would take up the position of Master of Assassins, and a seat on the High Lords of Terror, a position with considerably increased power and prestige in the new Imperium. After a while, this position would be abandoned by the Master of Assassins, presumably due to Malcador the Sigillite's original ideas of the Officio Assassinorum working to the benefit of the Imperium, but not steering or guiding it. This would also align with the principle behind the decision to create the Officio Assassinorum in the first place, when the Emperor made it clear that whilst he valued the Assassin's Blade, it required oversight. And if one of the Assassins were to sit upon the High Lords, well, that would rather complicate the oversight, wouldn't it? And this system would turn out to be a reasonably effective one for the next 1,500 years, with the Officio Assassinorum left mostly to its own devices to do what it did best. The High Lords had the authority to order it around, and the Master of Assassins could rein in the worst excesses of the various directors. But in the extremely suspicious period post-Heresy, where allegiances needed confirming and reaffirming, the Officio Assassinorum was far too busy in a tumultuous galaxy to worry overmuch about internal political intrigue. It could even be argued that the reason why the Officio Assassinorum functioned so effectively, whilst under its own de facto rule for over 1,000 years, was simply due to the fact that there was no shortage of enemies out there, and so they did not have enough time to worry about the handful of enemies in here. Indeed, when it came time for the 12th Master of Assassins to take up the position, a man by the name of Draken Vangrich, the Officio Assassinorum was almost seen as a bit of a quaint organization, a bit outdated perhaps, used primarily to make examples of rebellious provincial governors. The Imperium was stable. The threat of chaos had long since been defeated, or so they thought, and there were precious few external enemies left. Then, of course, the war against the beast started. And suddenly an Imperium that had gotten far too used to quiet, peaceful times found itself on the very precipice of annihilation. This was when the Officio Assassinorum first slipped its leash. But before we move on with that, a small out-of-universe rant is needed. For you see, Vangrich is a character from the Beast Arises book series. A series that I loathe. A series that I hate, with the burning passion of 1,000 white-hot stars. Not so much for the retardation of Primarch orcs, or teleporting asteroid space stations, or planet-sized Death Stars, but for the abysmally bad, deliberately, maliciously terrible writing and over-repeated reuse of plot points until I was eyeing the pond opposite my house with longing eyes, thinking of how drowning is supposed to be a pretty nice way to go. But it was not all bad. In fact, the intrigue parts pertaining to the High Lords and Draken Vangrich, the Master of Assassins, were genuinely excellent on occasions, to the point where, if the book series was just that, the tale of Draken Vangrich and his friends on the High Council, I would have loved the series. But alas, it was not, and whilst the Beast Arises series did also teach me some valuable lessons for the Horus Heresy Breakdown series, but if I could have learned those lessons equally well by roughly manhandling my Winky with a cheese grater, I would rather have done that than read those books. But hey, details. The point, which I am so laboriously trying to drag myself towards, is that Draken Vangrich is actually a really cool, well-fleshed out and interesting character that received a rough and unnecessarily rushed dicking at the end of the Beast Arises books. So, don't judge him overly harshly for what he ended up doing and what you're going to be hearing about in this book series. Because whilst Draken ended up being a wee bit of a naughty boy, he was also a very good boy, deserving of all the head pats which you can spare, and he is also probably the sole singular reason why I am talking to you today instead of resting comfortably at the bottom of a pond. So, take that into consideration. Draken Vangrich served as Master of Assassins during a period of near-perfect peace within the Imperium. This allowed for a great deal of complacency to seep in. In Vangrich's estimates, the current High Lords of Terror were fat, self-indulgent wastrels, occupied not just primarily, but singularly with cutting themselves an ever larger piece of the Imperial pie. They could not even be favourably compared with ticks, because at least that species of bloodsucker had the good graces to die eventually, whilst the satin and silk-draped vermin that besettled the seats of the High Lords spent the equivalent of a small planetary budget on rejuvenating treatments for themselves and their favourite bed-warmers. On the best of days, these obese lordships were merely an obstacle to the continued health of the Imperium, whilst on most days they were an active detriment to it. Nevertheless, Vangrich told himself that it was not his place to question. He could try and affect the High Lord's judgment or attempt to rein in the worst of their retardation and self-aggrandizement, but he was not a High Lord, nor did he necessarily wish to be one, and as long as the Imperium was stable, that was all that was required. Then the beast arrived, and all of that stability, all of that peace simply disappeared, and the High Lords were no longer a mere detriment. They were an active danger to the Imperium. They would sacrifice entire fleets, entire battle groups, whole armies, and vast portions of the Imperium's population in suicidal, vainglorious operations seemingly designed to do nothing more than aggrandize the fat fool that had dreamt them up. The Imperium was already being crushed under the sheer weight of incompetence displayed by the High Lords of Terror, and with the arrival of the Beast it was made blatantly obvious that there was no way for the Imperium to stand whilst weighed down by such blasphemous cookie dough. And so to save the Imperium, the master of assassins Draken Vangrich joined together with the last surviving Imperial Fist, Courland, and later with Maximus Thane of the reorganized Imperial Fists to take care of the problem by seizing control over the Imperium away from the High Lords. Courland even went so far as to execute the High Ecclesiarch Mesring when he, having gone quite mad, announced to the gathered lords that the Beast was the true Emperor. After that, the rest of the High Lords either fell in line, cooperated directly with the new bosses of the Imperium, or simply kept their mouths shut, voting whichever way they were told to. And after the defeat of the Beast, it appeared as if things might slowly but surely begin to return to normal. Courland, and with him the last of the Imperial Fists, had been slain during the war, but he had been replaced by Maximus Thane, who had taken command over the Last Wall, a organization of Imperial Fist successor chapters in an attempt to defeat the Beast. He had also subsequently rebuilt the Imperial Fists from forces taken from the other successor chapters. Maximus Thane also decreed that the Imperial Fists would no longer stay on Terra. Instead, they would venture out into the galaxy in an unending offensive against the Imperium's enemies, leaving behind Draken Vangrich and the High Lords. Vangrich had thought that at this point things could begin to return to normal. He would maintain a certain grip over the High Lords for the foreseeable future so as to ensure they did not lapse into previous sins. But it seemed as if the Imperium could return to a more stable, organized, and peaceful period. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Vangrich was informed that instead of following orders and destroying the Orc capital world of Ulanor, the Fabricator General, Kubik, had instead, by utilizing Orc technology, teleported it away instead of enacting the Ordered Exterminatus, securing the heretical technology for the Mechanicus. This was the last straw for Vangrich, who finally arrived at the conclusion that these High Lords would never put aside their own ambitions, their own lusts, their own goals, wants, and needs. The only way for the Imperium to flourish once more was to get rid of every last one of them and replace them with puppets. The act that was to become known as the beheading was over inside of the span of a single day. Every single High Lord was dead. Their vaunted security measures had availed them not one bit, and a handful of them had even been outright replaced by Assassinorum personnel, who had changed their features to resemble those of the High Lords. With his coup complete, Draken Vangrich would de facto rule the Imperium for the next 100 years. And in that period, he did a remarkable amount of good, to the point that even though everyone knew who the real ruler of the Imperium was, Despite the fact that everyone knew what he had done, it was simply ignored. First due to fear, because you do not speak up against the ruler of the Imperium if he also happens to be the master of assassins. But gradually, they chose to not speak up because Draken Vangrich was doing a remarkably good job of rebuilding the Imperium. Unfortunately, a position of such unbelievable power, authority, and responsibility is not one that any human mind can bear indefinitely. And whilst Vangrich ruled with remarkable efficiency for 80 full years, the last 20 years of his reign were marked with ever more unnecessary actions. Mass purges of the Senatorum Imperialis, political rivals turning up dead, and increasingly bizarre behavior in general. It appeared to those closest to him, and soon to the rest of the Imperium, as if the Master of Assassins had quite simply gone mad. And it eventually forced Maximus Thane to return to Terra to purge the Master of Assassins, and a considerable portion of his order as well. And so ended the first reign of assassins, but not the last. And whilst the actions of Draken Vangrich can, at the very least, be defended, as at the end of the day he did not do what he did for himself, for self-aggrandizement, for power, prestige, or position, he did what he genuinely thought would be in the best interest of the Imperium. One could even say that he was simply following the Officio Assassinorum's charter to its logical end. But the next man who would use the Officio to reign unopposed over the Imperium has no such excuse, and his name was Gog Vandir of the Adeptus Administratum. He was elected as the 361st Master of the Administratum during the Age of Apostasy, a period of considerable political and religious upheaval within the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy, you see, had gone quite mad with power, demanding ever more ridiculous tithes from the planets who owed them loyalty, tithes they used to build ever grander monuments to their own vanity, and occasionally to the Emperor as well. And very few were willing to, or able to, oppose the power of the ecclesiarchy. But Gog Vandir was different. He did not seek to manipulate or rein in the ecclesiarchy. He sought to simply bend or break it. And as a part of this plan, he launched a massive invasion of the planet Ophelia 7, the de facto capital of the Adeptus Ministorum. And after seizing control of it, Gog Vandir quite simply announced that the entire upper command echelon of the Ministorum were traitors and heretics, and had them all executed. After which he further announced that he would take the role of ecclesiarch upon himself, making him the leader of both the Administratum and the Ministorum, making him unquestionably the most powerful individual in the Imperium. And using that power, he went through the entire Ministorum's organizational roster, person by person, in search of further heretics and traitors. And like most witch hunters on the search for witches, he found plenty. And he did all of that to thunderous applause from the other High Lords, who had long suffered under the increasingly heavy boot of the ecclesiarchy. It would take a long time indeed, and many an atrocity, before Gog Vandir was finally brought to justice. During his reign, he became the de facto ruler of not just the Administratum and the ecclesiarchy, but also the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the Imperial Guard, and, of course, the Officio Assassinorum. That last tool in particular he used exceptionally liberally. And that was not to be the end of the Officio Assassinorum's business in the Age of Apostasy. For one of the reasons why Gog Vandir had been able to use it so liberally without any resistance or pushback from the Master of Assassins was because one of Gog's own agents, a careless assassin, had apparently assassinated the Grand Master and utilized the art of shapeshifting to impersonate him. Unfortunately for Yarek, he was not quite as good of an assassin as he had thought he was. The Grand Master had survived the assassination attempt by placing a body double in his stead. And, after the disposal of Gog Vandir, the original Grand Master launched a great offensive upon Yarek, launching a civil war within the Officio Assassinorum, where both parties drew upon every single resource at their disposal. And considering the vast and often extraordinarily illegal nature of the Officio's arsenal, you can imagine that was quite the vicious conflict. And the horrors of the assassin civil wars, the so-called Wars of Vindication, were not exactly lessened by the fact that it primarily took place within the corridors and great halls of the Imperial Palace itself. And since it had just gone through the invasion of Terra that eventually brought Gog Vandir to justice, this second conflict was not exactly kind on the ancient, venerable structure, reducing much of it yet further. In fact, the Wars of Vindication were such a bloodbath and such a destructive event that after its completion, steps were taken to ensure that it could never happen again. For whilst much can be said in favour of cleaning one's own house, this particular spring cleaning went well and truly beyond its limits. The first change would be to the organizational structure of the Officio Assassinorum. They, as previously mentioned, had all of their temples located on Terra. This would now change. They were free to maintain headquarters on Terra, but the temples would be scattered throughout the galaxy, so as to ensure that if the rot set in one temple, it would be isolated from all of the others. Furthermore, the various temples themselves would also be scattered into various sub-orders and clades, making sure that the entirety of the Calidus could not be corrupted, or the entirety of the Vindicari, and so on. And the second major change, possibly even more impactful, despite not having to do with the Officio's internal structure, was the creation of the Ordo Sicarius, of the God Emperor's Most Holy Inquisition. This order was tasked specifically with keeping an eye on the Officio Assassinorum, and preferably preventing any further catastrophes, if at all possible. Furthermore, the order also placed yet further limitations upon the Officio Assassinorum. The most important of which is that the deployment of any assassin needs to be approved of by a 2/3 majority of the High Lords of Terra or the Senatorum Imperialis. Furthermore, any assassination is to be followed by a detailed, in-depth combat report, which is to be made available to the Ordo Sicarius whenever requested. And finally, all assassins, with the exception of those belonging to the Eversor Temple, must subject themselves to regular psycho-indoctrination therapy if they are requested to do so by an Ordo Sicarius operative. Now I'm sure you're wondering, why are the Eversor assassins allowed to ignore these requests? Well, it's not so much that they're allowed to ignore them, as the Ordo sees no point in making the request in the first place. Because to subject an Eversword assassin to psycho-indoctrination, he must first be thawed out. And frankly, it's just not worth the risk. And so, there you have it. The Officio Assassinorum in the 41st millennium. Its powers has been quite severely curtailed after the Age of Apostasy. Its temples scattered throughout the galaxy, and it now has its own dedicated ordo of watchdogs to ensure that it doesn't go off the rails and destroy half the Imperial Palace again, or whichever other priceless Imperial structures might be nearby when they're having their spring cleaning. Nevertheless, the Officio is far too valuable a tool to discard. It may occasionally bite the hand that feeds it, but 2 separate instances over the course of 10,000 odd years? All in all, that's not that bad of a track record. And whilst yes, they certainly are proving to be quite a handful for the Ordo Sicarius, who constantly have to try and stay one step in front of an order of assassins that have gotten very, very used to ensuring that they are always the ones in the lead. Well, it's worked out relatively well so far. The Ordo Sicarius has only uncovered a handful of attempts on high-ranking Imperial officials and 1 or 2 High Lords of Terror, which, again, considering it's been, 4,000 years? All things being equal, that's pretty good by 40k standards. But of course, even though the Officio Assassinorum has proven its value, it would be nothing without the assassins themselves. And now that we've looked at the Officio, at its fundament and its history, we can move on to the really interesting stuff. The assassins themselves. And we will be starting with the patient assassins of the Vindicar Temple. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.